The marketplace was alive with chatter that afternoon. Merchants called out to passers-by, children darted between stalls, and neighbors exchanged laughter as they negotiated over fruits and spices. The sun bathed the square in golden warmth, painting everything in vibrant color. Yet, amid all this life and joy, a man sat on the ground, almost invisible to the world. His clothes were torn and covered in dust. His hair was unkempt, and his eyes carried a weight that words could hardly describe. He was a homeless man, nameless to most, familiar only as the beggar by the fountain. As people passed him, some shook their heads with pity, others turned their faces away as though ashamed to even acknowledge his existence. But then, a group of young men noticed him. Instead of offering a hand or even a kind word, they began to laugh. One mocked the way he sat hunched over. Another pretended to stumble beside him, drawing more attention. The crowd nearby caught on to the commotion, and soon, the square echoed with cruel laughter. The homeless man lowered his head. He didn't protest, didn't defend himself. He just sat quietly, bearing the humiliation like a burden too familiar to fight. Every chuckle, every pointed finger, every cruel word piled onto his silence, as though he had already accepted this as his fate. For many in that crowd, it was nothing more than a moment of entertainment, something to laugh about before moving on with their day. But destiny had other plans, for among those walking through the square that afternoon was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Traoré's car, a modest vehicle compared to the official convoys of other leaders, slowed to a halt as he spotted the crowd gathered. His eyes, sharp yet deeply human, scanned the scene. He asked his driver to stop. Without hesitation, he stepped out. The chatter quieted slightly when people recognized him. Here was the man known for his courage, for standing tall against injustice, for embodying hope in a land struggling to find its footing. Yet in that moment, he wasn't there to give a speech or lead a rally. He was there as a witness, one who could not ignore what he had just seen. He walked toward the crowd with calm, measured steps. Conversations hushed, laughter faltered, and whispers spread. It's him. It's Traore. But the young men who had been mocking the beggar didn't stop. Emboldened by the attention, they laughed louder, as though trying to prove they weren't afraid. The homeless man, still sitting silently, hadn't even looked up. To him, it must have felt like another day of humiliation, another day where no one stood up for him. Traore reached the edge of the circle, his presence commanding but not harsh. He looked at the homeless man for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to the crowd. His voice, deep and steady, broke the silence. "Tell me," he began, "what do you see when you look at this man?" The question caught them off guard. No one answered. Some looked down at their feet, others exchanged nervous glances. Traore stepped closer, his eyes moving from face to face. "Do you see a man, or do you only see his poverty? Do you see a human being, or only the rags on his back?" The square grew silent. The laughter had vanished completely. Then, slowly, Traore crouched down beside the homeless man, placing a hand on his shoulder. For the first time, the man looked up. His eyes met Traore's, and in them was something more than sorrow. There was surprise, perhaps even disbelief, that someone of such stature would acknowledge him. Traore spoke again, this time more softly, as if addressing both the man and the crowd. "This man has lived a story you do not know. He has faced battles you have never fought. You laugh because it is easy. You mock because it costs you nothing. But tell me, when you fall, when hardship finds you, would you want the world to laugh, or would you want a hand to lift you?" His words cut through the air like a blade. The crowd stood frozen, their earlier amusement now transformed into shame. Mothers pulled their children closer, merchants lowered their eyes, and even the young men who had started the laughter were struck silent. The homeless man blinked, and a tear rolled down his cheek. Traore noticed. Without hesitation, he reached into his own pocket and pulled out some money. Not to toss carelessly, not to rid himself of obligation, but to place it gently into the man's hand. More importantly, he didn't walk away after that. He asked the man's name. He listened to his story. The crowd, once amused by cruelty, now watched a moment of humanity unfold before their eyes. They saw a leader not above his people but among them. They saw strength not in power or wealth but in compassion and dignity. And in that moment, silence hung heavy. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of hearts moved, of lessons learned without a single shout or command. Traore finally stood, turning once more to the crowd. "A nation is not built on laughter at the weak," he said firmly. "It is built when we lift each other, when we give dignity where the world has taken it away. If you want to mock someone, mock me, but never mock a man who already carries the weight of the world." And with that, he guided the homeless man to his car. The crowd parted quietly, no longer laughing, no longer pointing. Instead, they stepped aside with bowed heads, as though realizing the gravity of what they had just witnessed. The man who had once been invisible was now seen, not as a beggar, not as an object of ridicule, but as a human being whose worth had been restored in front of all. The square returned to life soon after, but the memory lingered. Stories of what Traore had done spread quickly, retold in markets, homes, and gatherings. Some spoke of his courage, others of his compassion. But everyone agreed on one thing. They would never forget the day a leader silenced a crowd, not with anger, not with force, but with humanity. Because in that single act, Traore had reminded them of a truth that many had forgotten, that the measure of a people is not in how they treat the powerful, but in how they treat the most vulnerable. And in that square, under the golden sun of an ordinary afternoon, the dignity of one man became the dignity of all. For the homeless man, it was a day he would never forget. For the crowd, it was a lesson they would carry with them. And for Traore, it was simply what had to be done. For his heart could not allow him to do otherwise. That night, the city buzzed with whispers of what had happened. Some dismissed it as a passing moment, just another story to fill the silence over dinner. But for others, it gnawed at them. They replayed the image in their minds. A powerful leader, not standing on a podium, not delivering grand speeches, but crouching beside a man everyone else ignored. It was the sort of image that made people question themselves, question their society, and wonder how many times they had walked past someone without a second thought. In homes lit by soft lanterns and in small tea shops tucked into alleyways, the story spread. A young boy told his mother he didn't want to laugh at beggars anymore. A shopkeeper, ashamed of his earlier laughter, found himself unable to sleep. Even the young men who had started it all felt the sting of guilt heavier than any punishment could have delivered. They didn't expect Traore to remember their faces, but they would forever remember his words. The homeless man himself was overwhelmed. For years, he had lived in the shadows of the city, collecting scraps of food, relying on the mercy or mockery of strangers. But that single encounter shifted something inside him. For the first time in so long, he felt seen. He felt human again. When Traore asked for his name, he had whispered it like a secret, Issa. The name spread along with the story. No longer just the beggar by the fountain. He was Issa, the man who reminded a whole community of its humanity. The next morning, Traore visited Issa again, not with cameras or a press entourage, but quietly with just a couple of aides. He wanted to know Issa's story, not the fragments that people gossiped about, but the truth. And so Issa spoke. Once he had been like anyone else, with a family, a home, and work. He had dreams of raising his children with dignity, of building something lasting. But life had been cruel. A sickness took his wife. A series of misfortunes, debts, and betrayals took his livelihood. And with no one to lean on, he found himself on the streets, stripped of everything except his name. "People think I am lazy," Issa said softly, "but they do not see the nights I go hungry, or the winters I shiver with no blanket. They only see the man I have become, not the man I once was." Traore listened, his heart heavy. He had always known poverty was a beast that consumed silently, but hearing it firsthand from Issa gave the struggle a face, a voice, a story. He promised Issa that this would not be the end of his journey, that dignity could be restored, that he was not beyond hope. News of Traore's private visits began to circulate. Some criticized him, saying a leader shouldn't waste time on one man when an entire nation needed his attention. But many more admired him for it. They saw in him something rare, a leader who didn't just speak of justice and equality but lived it in small, quiet actions. Days turned into weeks, and Issa's life slowly began to change. He was given access to shelter, medical care, and most importantly, an opportunity to work again. But beyond the material changes, what mattered most was how people now treated him. Those who once laughed now greeted him. Children who had mocked him now smiled shyly as they passed. Neighbors began to share food, not as charity, but as community. The transformation of Issa became a symbol, a living reminder of the power of dignity. He was not a politician, not a warrior, not a wealthy man. Yet, because one leader chose compassion over indifference, Issa's life became a mirror that forced others to confront their own humanity. But this story wasn't just about Issa. It became about everyone who had ever been pushed aside, ignored, or ridiculed. Women selling vegetables in the market began defending beggars when others mocked them. Men started questioning the cruelty of turning away from those in need. Even children, in their innocent way, began to carry the lesson. One boy was overheard telling his friends, "Don't laugh at him. He might be like Issa." The ripple effect spread far beyond the city square. In villages, in schools, in offices, people spoke of it. If Traore can stop for one man, they asked, what excuse do we have not to stop for each other? For Traore, this was never about making headlines. When asked later by a close advisor why he had stopped that day, his answer was simple. A leader is not measured by how he treats the strong, he said. He is measured by how he treats the ones who cannot fight back. If we ignore them, we ignore ourselves. The story of Issa continued to echo, but not everyone welcomed it. Some elites scoffed, saying such displays of compassion were theatrics. Others feared the message, for if people began to see the dignity of the poor, they might also start questioning the systems that kept them in poverty. Yet no amount of criticism could erase the memory burned into the hearts of those who had witnessed that afternoon. And as weeks turned into months, Issa's life became a quiet testament to resilience. He didn't become rich overnight. He didn't suddenly transform into a different man. But he walked with his head a little higher. He greeted people with a steadier voice. And every time he passed by the fountain where he had once been mocked, he no longer felt the sting of shame, because he knew that his life had mattered enough to silence a crowd. For the people, the lesson was clear. They realized that true power wasn't in wealth or status. It wasn't in mocking the weak or laughing at those who had less. True power was in kindness, in lifting someone when the world pushed them down. And that realization, born from one simple act, began to change not just Issa, but everyone around him. And so, while history would remember Traore as a bold leader on the political stage, many in that city would remember him first as the man who stopped for Issa, the man who silenced laughter with dignity. For in that moment, Traore did more than protect one man. He reminded an entire nation of its soul. Months later, the city square bustled with its usual rhythm. Vendors shouted, children darted between stalls, and men debated politics over steaming cups of tea. But something had changed in the atmosphere. The mocking laughter that once echoed whenever someone poor passed by had quieted. People still joked, still teased each other, but there was a line they no longer crossed. That invisible line had been drawn the day Traore stopped, turned, and silenced the crowd. Issa, now working in a small repair shop arranged through community support, walked through that square one morning. He carried himself differently. His clothes were modest but clean, his face weathered but dignified. When children waved at him, he waved back. When a vendor offered him fruit, he accepted without hesitation. No longer the invisible man, no longer the target of ridicule, he was a living reminder that no soul is beyond respect. One afternoon, a group of young men gathered near the fountain, much like before. But this time, when another poor traveler walked past with tattered shoes and tired eyes, the instinct to laugh faltered. One boy, remembering Traore's words, spoke softly, "We shouldn't laugh. You never know his story." The others nodded. Something had shifted in their hearts. What had once been mockery was replaced with caution, with empathy. And though it seemed like a small change, it was revolutionary in its own way. Leaders often dream of changing nations through policies, speeches, and wars. But sometimes, true change begins in the smallest of places. In the silence after a cruel laugh, in the choice to extend a hand instead of a jeer, in the decision of ordinary people to see dignity where they once saw weakness. Traore knew this. That's why he didn't boast about the incident, didn't ask for it to be written into speeches. To him, it wasn't an accomplishment, it was simply the right thing to do. Yet, in that simplicity lay its power. People remembered because it was real, uncalculated, human. As for Issa, his life remained humble, but he never again felt like a ghost drifting through the streets. On Fridays, he was often seen sitting outside the mosque, greeting passers-by, his voice carrying gratitude instead of bitterness. Sometimes, children would sit with him, asking him to tell the story of the day the president stopped for him. He would smile, shake his head, and say, "The story isn't about me, it's about all of us. It's about remembering that no matter how low a man falls, he is still a man." And each time he said it, those listening understood. Years later, when people recalled Traoré's leadership, they remembered his political strength, his defiance against foreign powers, and his vision for a stronger nation. But in the hearts of ordinary citizens, one story stood above all others: the day he chose to defend a homeless man against laughter. That moment lived longer than policies, longer than speeches, because it wasn't about politics. It was about humanity. Some would say it was just a fleeting act of kindness, a drop in the ocean of a leader's responsibilities. But for those who witnessed it, it was more than that. It was a revelation. It proved that leadership wasn't about standing above people, but about kneeling beside them when they needed it most. And so, the legend of that afternoon endured. Mothers told it to their children as a lesson in compassion. Teachers used it as an example when explaining dignity. Even preachers drew from it, reminding their congregations that mocking the weak was mocking the Creator's own work. It is easy for a nation to forget its poor, to walk past its hungry, to treat its homeless as invisible. But it only takes one moment of courage, one act of kindness, to jolt a people awake. Traoré gave that jolt, not with a law, not with a weapon, but with his heart. And Issa, he became proof that one man's dignity can ripple outward, touching lives far beyond his own. In the laughter that never returned, in the silence that carried respect, in the kindness that bloomed where cruelty once lived, Issa's story lived on. Because sometimes, the most powerful way to lead is not through the roar of speeches, but through the quiet act of protecting someone the world has forgotten. And that is why, even when the crowd laughed, Traoré's response silenced them all, forever.